I mentioned this. I find it a superb example of a programmatic, systematic program of research and theory, starting about 30 years ago, developing the theory in the context of a very circumscribed procedure, the concurrent chains procedure with pigeons, and then supporting the plausibility of that theory through some very, very elegant experiments, mostly within that paradigm, but then fairly quickly extending the principle, the delay reduction principle, to account for important phenomena in foraging, human observing, human decision-making. So it makes, I think, just a wonderful model of a type of scientific progress of a principle that's established in a limited domain and extended into larger and more socially relevant domains. The title of the talk is From Basics to Contemporary Paradigms, Delay Reduction.
A colleague of mine, David Case, told me a couple times recently that one should always start a talk with a joke. Now, I've never done that before, but if that's the way you're supposed to do it, I'll try to do it. Problem is, before leaving last night, I took out this encyclopedia of jokes, and I looked up delay reduction, and there weren't any jokes about delay reduction that I thought I could share with you. Apparently, it's no laughing matter. But if that causes you to fear that this talk will be so dull it will put you to sleep, I can guarantee that you won't fall asleep. The reason I can guarantee it is I took the red eye last night. I'm absolutely exhausted, and if my talk is dull, I'll fall asleep far sooner than you'll have a chance to. In any event, rather than try to sound like Vice President Al Gore, I think I will begin by telling you what delay reduction theory is. And delay reduction theory refers to the fact that an outcome will be chosen not primarily on the basis of its absolute delay to primary reinforcement, but on the extent to which the outcome represents a reduction in delay to reinforcement. Delay reduction theory, then, is a relativistic or contextual theory. I review the background, how the theory came about, the basic theory, how the theory is applied, and it's very simple math. I'm almost ashamed to be at a SQAB invited tutorial with such a simple view of the world, and to what the theory may be applied. The background, well, the matching law, which you'll be hearing more about later, and it's arguably, after reinforcement, the principle of reinforcement per se, the most important advance in behavior analysis ever. The matching law was already of great import and creating much excitement in the 60s when I was a graduate student, and it was natural that I started working in that area. And for those few of you who may not know what the matching law is, it just simply, at a simple level, states that an organism's choice proportions should match the proportions of reinforcements arranged for those outcomes. And it was natural to then apply the matching law, which has been so successful and is still so successful in helping us appreciate choice behavior, to the concurrent chains paradigm, which involved choice for condition reinforcers. And it's a paradigm which is shown in this very old overhead. Basically, the pigeon, or whatever the organism, is confronted with two white key lights, and occasionally pecks at one of the white key lights produces a color change, green on the left key, the right key becomes dark and inoperative, or red on the right key and the left key becomes dark and inoperative. Okay? After that food is obtained, a new trial begins. It was natural to assume that the rate of responding in the initial links in the choice phase was a function of the rates of reinforcement in the outcome phase. That is, it was natural to assume that, as in simple matching, choice would match the relative rates of reinforcement in the outcomes. And I certainly expected that that was the case. Studies supporting that notion in the early 60s were done by one of Dick Herrnstein's students, Sandy O'Toole, his dissertation in 1960, later published in a 69 volume, edited by Derek Henry, and Dick Herrnstein himself in a well-known 1964 article in the Journal of Experimental Analysis of Behavior. And their studies showed that indeed subjects matched their choice proportions to the relative rate of reinforcement in the outcome phase. The issue of temporal context was not at the forefront at that time. No one, to my knowledge, really questioned whether the choice phase had anything to do with the proportion of choices made for what was being chosen. It just wasn't thought about. And I may not have been the first time, but the first time I remember being asked, should the choice phase matter, was 3 years after I'd gotten my degree. It was Derek Henry organized a Chicago conference on condition reinforcement in this city, of course. And at this conference, someone, I believe it was Stan Pliskov, in the audience, asked me, as I was giving a talk on gambling in the Pigeon, asked me if the results would change if we varied the choice phase. And I said, I don't know, but I don't see why they would. That was all. And didn't think much more about that question. But a different question, the time wasn't ripe for that kind of question to be taken seriously, but a different kind of question was being asked, which actually led to the answer to the ignored question. The different question was raised several times by a couple of the participants in the Chicago conference and also by colleagues of mine. Barbara Scorl, I believe, was one person who asked me the following. How do we know, how do we who study choice in concurrent chains, how do we know that it was the outcome schedule that determined choice rather than, say, the overall rate of primary reinforcement? Consider this following schedule. This is a high-tech overhead made not 20 years ago, but this is a fairly recent vintage, like 2 days ago. Consider this situation, where the initial links, one is VI90 and one is VI30. The VI90 leads to VI30, the VI30 leads to VI90. In case this is not clear, the outcomes being chosen are VI30 and VI90. The question is, what happens in the choice phase? The question people had asked me was, if the overall rate of reinforcement is identical on these two routes to reward, namely, in this case, 1 every 120 seconds, perhaps choice will be indifferent. Maybe that's what's controlling choice. We had assumed, I, Herrnstein, and others, we all assumed that what was critical was the difference here, and that this outcome should be 3 times as preferred as this outcome, because it paid off 3 times as often. But suppose really what was controlling choice in the choice phase was the overall rate of reinforcement, which it turns out is confounded with the difference in the outcomes in all the studies that have been done. So I designed this study to address that question. If overall rate of reinforcement was critical, pigeons should be indifferent. If we were right and matching was critical, pigeons should respond 3 times as often here as here. There's a third logical possibility, which no one promoted. It could be the condition reinforcement, the rate at which you get out of the choice phase is, oh, thank you, Rick, is critical. And in that case, actually, pigeons should be choosing this 3 to 1. And then, of course, there are all kinds of intermediate possibilities. I was expecting to get matching, to get a 3 to 1 preference for this outcome, despite the fact that rate of condition reinforcement and overall rate of reinforcement were working against that outcome. That was the first study I set up on arriving at UCSD, and I set it up, ran it myself, and was delighted as the results began pouring in. Choice proportions quickly left 50% and went soaring up towards 3 to 1, confirming my hypothesis. I became less delighted as the choice proportions kept soaring further and further. And I was baffled So it was gnawing at me day after day that the preference was up. I don't remember now truthfully what it went up to, but it was getting close to exclusive preference for this side, which made no sense at all. Far more extreme than the matching view, and of course, totally in the opposite direction from the other two viewpoints that I deemed possible in the situation. Well, the upshot of this gnawing and gnawing at me is one morning I woke up having had a dream which led me to conclude that it was the context that was critical and not the outcomes. And unfortunately, it's the only productive dream I've ever had, because that's an easy way to do research. In fact, my dreams are absolutely, when I was when I had a grim medical prognosis some 8.5 years ago, Tony Wright wrote me a very sympathetic letter in which he said, "Oh, you must wake up in a cold sweat every night." The fact of the matter is, grim as the prognosis is, I never have nightmares about that. I never dream about work, never dream about anything exciting. I dream about walking, waiting for the bus, the most mundane, shopping. In any event, but this time I put my sleep to something useful. And I woke up, grabbed a pad, and thought that what was critical was the fact that these stimuli are reinforcers to the extent that they represent an improvement from the previous situation. Later, Billy Baum was to coin the phrase, or maybe at that time had already coined the phrase, situation transition. And that's what seemed to me the case. And that would explain the equation I'll show you in a moment, the simple equation I'll show you in a moment, would explain the results in this experiment. And that equation is this. RL, which this is just the choice proportion, responses on the left divided by responses on the left plus responses on the right, equals T minus T sub L. T is the overall time to reinforcement from the onset of a trial, from the onset of the choice phase. So that's how far away the subject is at the outset. T, small t sub L, is how much time to reward when the left outcome is obtained. T sub small r is how much time to reinforcement when the right outcome is obtained. So clearly, T minus TL is the delay reduction, in the sense of reduction in time to reinforcement, associated with onset of the left outcome, and T minus TR is the reduction in time to reinforcement associated with the production of the right outcome. And this equation is a form of matching. It says that matching is choice proportions match delay reduction proportions. And the way to test this is not just with the experiment I showed, but the obvious way to test it is to take two outcome schedules and vary the duration of the choice phase, which will vary t, and you should get different choice proportions, as I'll show you in a moment. Here is the predictions. As you vary the value of the initial length for given outcome values, preference could vary from exclusive preference for the preferred outcome all the way down to 0.55. Ultimately, of course, with the right values, you could get it down essentially to 50%. And I won't show you the data because the data fell pretty closely on this line. I mean, reasonably so. How do we calculate? Let me just take at most 5 minutes to show you how one calculates, since this is a tutorial, delay reduction in this simple case. And that's the only case we'll consider. Two cases. Well, first, with initial lengths of 120 seconds. 120 seconds leading to a 30-second outcome, 120 seconds leading to a 90-second outcome. T, the time to reinforcement from the onset of a choice phase, equals 60 seconds, which is the time in the choice period. Why 60 seconds? Because the VI 120-second schedules are operating concurrently. Therefore, in a 120-second period, you get two reinforcers, two entries into the outcomes, or one every 60 seconds. So the choice time is 60 seconds. The outcome time, well, with equal initial links. Half the time you get 30 seconds. Half the time you get 90 seconds. So it's 60 plus half of 30 plus half of 90. And that works out to be 120 seconds. Applying the delay reduction equation then, we have 120 minus 30 over 120 minus 30 plus 120 minus 90 equals 0.75. Okay? Is that clear? Notice I cleverly chose this example so that the prediction is identical to the matching prediction. And so we can, it's obvious that in the experiments O'Toole and Herrnstein did, it just happened that they chose values where it worked out that matching made comparable predictions. And just one more. If you change the initial lengths to 600 seconds, everything is identical except t is now 300 seconds plus a half 30 plus a half 90. T now becomes 360 seconds, and the choice proportion is 360 minus 30 over 360 minus 30 plus 360 minus 90, and that works out to be 0.55. At the other extreme, you can have very short initial lengths. Then, in fact, only one of these outcomes will represent a reduction in time to reinforcement, and you should get exclusive preference for the preferred outcome. This theory had a severe flaw. What would happen, and I don't have an overhead to demonstrate it, but what would happen if you had unequal initial lengths, let's say 90-30 again, and your terminal lengths were equal, 30-30. Equal outcomes, unequal initial lengths, 30 versus 90. Well, most of us would expect preference on the VI 30 side. That's an empirical question. You do the experiment. This is one time when intuition is supported. You get preference on the VI 30 side. It turns out then that those who said that the overall rate of reinforcement is a determiner of choice had a good point after all. When delay reduction is equal, the effect of the overall rate of reinforcement becomes evident. And thus, Squires and Fantino, Nancy Squires did the empirical work, showed that you do get preference for the shorter initial link when the terminal links are equal. And expressing it instead of as a proportion, these are ratios, but it's the same idea. Instead of it just being T minus TL over T minus TR, delay reduction on the left over delay reduction on the right, you have to multiply by the overall rate of reinforcement, RL here, RR. This has a benefit. This was 1971. Nancy and I published this paper, January of 71. The benefit here is if there are no initial links, this equation reduces to matching. So it's an extension of matching, of the matching law, reducing to matching in the case of no initial links. So is it clear then? The overall rate of reinforcement does play a role. It's just that it was dwarfed in the original study I showed you by the effects of delay reduction. Okay. Now that we've established in the outline of this procedure the choice is a function of both delay reduction and overall rate of reinforcement, I should add that often, even though if I'd been clear, no one would have this thought now, but I've come across often colleagues as well as students who confuse delay reduction with immediacy of reinforcement and basically say, well, delay reduction just refers to how close you are to food. And that really is what matching was. You can tease apart these. You can show that the context actually can be manipulated so that matching and delay reduction make dramatically different predictions. And Roger Dunn and I did that in a study. And here is can't tell you what the actual values were. The terminal link durations are here. I don't know what the initial link durations were. But the point is that you can create a situation where matching is predicting this kind of result and delay reduction is predicting this kind of change, just dramatically different. And the results, while variable, clearly do not support matching but do support delay reduction. So again, delay reduction is not a question of immediacy. It's a question of context. How much better does the situation get when a new situation is obtained? And I'll try to repeat that at least one more time as I close the talk. What about some applications? In theory, we could apply delay reduction, although it rarely has been. We could apply delay reduction to aversive control. The same principles really apply. As you get, the more you remove an aversive situation, the more reinforcing it is relative to where you were. Since I already referred to my health, let me go back to when I was 49 years old. I thought at that time, although I never said this publicly or to anyone, but secretly, call it the invulnerability of youth, although 49 may not sound young to some of you. It certainly does to me now. But at 49, I thought I was going to live till 90. And if someone had told me when I was 49 that I was likely to die at 60, I would have been crushed. It would have been the worst news I ever had. 2 months later, I thought I was going to die at 51. If someone had told me that I was going to die at 60 then, I would have done cartwheels. It would have been about the best news I ever had. So you can't judge an outcome, and some of you may find it hard to believe, but I sympathize or empathize with someone who has a few weeks to live and is fighting on for those extra days. That always seemed inexplicable to me that someone would do that. But depending on what the situation is, the same outcome can be dramatically reinforcing or aversive in different situations. But we won't go. Some of the work on the aversive analog to delay reduction has been done in the area of observing, and David Case did some of that work early on. What I'd like instead to spend some time on is an area that Rick was kind enough to refer to, and an area that was actually inspired by one of our audience members, George Collier, who started basically an experimental analysis using analogs of foraging behavior. And in fact, I won't take the time, and especially with George here, don't want to risk butchering his experiment, but this is an experiment that he reported way back in 1977, in which he showed that you could create an interesting analog of foraging behavior in the laboratory and get rather clean data that would be very difficult to get, however valuable, in the field. Stephen Lee adapted the Collier procedure for pigeons, and this procedure, which I'll walk us through, because I'm sure there are a few people here unfamiliar with it, is the procedure that we have utilized in some of our work. The situation here is different than the concurrent chains procedure that I began with. In this procedure, we begin with a search phase in which only one key is present. And the subject responds in the presence of that white key on, let's say, a fixed interval x second schedule. And with a probability, and in all but one experiment I'll refer to, the probability is 1/2. So in most cases, with an equal probability, the subject then has a choice of this box or this box. In other words, the dark key, when the FI schedule is satisfied, becomes either red or green. Okay? Is that clear? The choice here is not between red and green, as it would be in the concurrent chains or in most concurrent schedules. Here the choice is between accepting or rejecting red when it's offered, or accepting or rejecting green when it is offered. Or to be more precise, the choice in this box is between continuing to respond on white, which will bring the subject back to the search phase. Ignore this 30 seconds, because in almost all cases that's irrelevant. I should have whited that out. So the subject can either respond 3 times and return to the search phase, or respond 3 times accepting the proffered outcome and move on to what George Collier called the handling phase. In his case, he gave rats a similar type of choice, except they were pressing a lever. They could press an accept lever or a reject lever, basically. Okay, so the question then is, will subjects accept or reject the red key light? And let's take a look Well, in this case, notice that there's a VI 5-second schedule associated with the red key light. So that the subject, given that the alternative, in the presence of the green key light, there's a VI 20-second schedule associated, correlated. Is that clear? So clearly the subject should always accept the VI 5-second schedule, and it always does. I mean, basically we get 100% acceptance of the preferred outcome. Well, I shouldn't say always does. We've done dozens of experiments, and recently we've come in with the occasional pigeon who doesn't. But for all intents and purposes, 100% of the time, our pigeons, all of our pigeons, accept the richer alternative. The poorer alternative, the question is, under what conditions do they accept the poorer alternative? In this case, the green key light, which, if accepted, will commit the subject to a VI 20-second schedule. By the way, after the food is obtained on either the VI 5-second schedule or the VI 20-second schedule, the subject returns to search. A new trial begins. Is this procedure clear? Yes? How does delay reduction apply to this type of procedure? Let's say the search time in this case is X seconds, which in fact it was on the graph, so we're being consistent. Outcome A, the outcome on the left, is VI 5-second schedule. Outcome B, the outcome on the right, is a VI 20-second schedule. When faced with a choice, let's say choice B, that's the choice I said was of interest, the choice for the poorer outcome. Choice or rejection of the poorer outcome. Selection or rejection of the poorer outcome. If the subject chooses B, food is 20 seconds away. On the other hand, if the subject chooses to search again, food, it can be readily calculated, is X seconds, which is the new search time. Half the time it'll be 5 seconds away, half the time 20 seconds away. Food is 12.5 plus X seconds away if the subject rejects the outcome. So one can just calculate when does 12.5 plus X equal 20, and an indifference point should come when X equals 7.5 seconds. Is that clear? If X is greater than 7.5 seconds, the subject should always choose B. Only it represents a reduction in time to reward. If X is less than 7.5 seconds, the subject should always reject B because it is more optimal to go back and search. And these predictions are made identically by the optimal diet model of optimal foraging theory and delay reduction. And the results of one of our studies, and there are others, this is Abarca and Fantino, 1982, and although there's variability, and there always is in these studies, but remember the number of trials is much fewer than you get with concurrent chains. It's a trial-by-trial study rather than a free operant study. And the indifference point in this case turned out to be exactly 7.5 seconds, if you extrapolate there. The important thing to note, by the way, this is an aside, is that the predictions, the basic prediction of the optimal foraging theory and the basic finding that George Collier found and Stephen Lee found, we also find, namely, as the search time gets longer, the subject should be more accepting of the poorer alternative. There's a clear increasing function. And as I said, the indifference point happens to come where it's supposed to. That's 7.5 seconds. So the results are consistent. An advantage of this is that new predictions are created. No one had ever speculated on how handling time should affect choice for the poorer outcome in this situation. And without going into details, it turns out that the optimal diet model, and if you ask a behavioral ecologist that I have, what will happen if we vary the handling time here with amounts of reward different? Vary the handling time here, and a behavioral ecologist will have to stop and think. And then they'll say, oh, yeah, you should get this pattern, which, in fact, you do get, and is predicted by delay reduction. A more interesting prediction I find, and some of you may know this prediction from the literature or may even have heard me discuss it at some prior convention, has to do with Nerea and I published a behavioral and brain science paper on this general topic some years ago. And while I was waiting nervously to get the commentaries from the various critics, the one thing I most feared was that we would receive something that was incomprehensible and damning from some biologist or economist. And we were lucky. It seemed like nothing happened. I was particularly worried about a commentary that was being prepared by Alec Koselnik, a good friend, but someone who's a trenchant critic, and John Krebs. And I was sure that their commentary would cause us to at least have to do some serious thinking. And in fact, the commentary was very positive and benign. And I breathed a sigh of relief, and the next day came a phone call. And it was from Steve Harned, the editor of BBS, saying, we just got a fax from England and from John Krebs. They want to change their commentary. So I figured that can't be good. Anyway, the commentary came. I looked it over. They decided that they didn't like what we had done. They had it was too simple-minded a model, which is typical of our work, perhaps. But they had a more elaborate model that they felt necessary to properly mimic what was going on in the situation. And so I toyed with their model and came to the conclusion that, which just delighted me, came to the realization that their model made the following prediction. If you shorten the search time only to the poorer outcome, and the procedure I showed you, the search time's constant for all, but it needn't be. You could have a different search time for each outcome. If you shorten the search time only for the poorer outcome, leaving the search time for the richer outcome constant, you should get, according to their model, increased rejection of the poorer outcome. In other words, make the poorer outcome more accessible, and the subject should reject it more readily. That didn't make sense to me. I was delighted. In fact, I checked it out. It didn't make sense to anybody. I polled people. Everyone agreed that that was ridiculous. But before I had gotten to that point, just 5 or 10 minutes after I made this deduction and was pleased that I could just write in the commentary, well, their fine model makes this ridiculous prediction, I also showed that their model could be reduced with a couple simplifying assumptions to delay reduction. And that gave me pleasure for about 5 seconds. Yes. So so it seemed necessary to go out and do the study, which should show that at least in this situation, delay reduction and the optimal diet model, for that matter, could not handle the data. Ray Preston and I did the study. We did it 2 ways. I found this kind of interesting. If you vary the probability of the poorer outcome, the models predict just what our common sense predicts. Namely, as you make the poorer outcome more probable, the subject should be more accepting of it. But when you vary accessibility the different way, by shortening the search time, the opposite prediction is made by the models. Now, the subject should be more rejecting of the more accessible poorer outcome. Okay? So we have 2 different ways to vary accessibility. They lead to opposite predictions according to the models, but our common sense tells us that they should be the same. First, the one that's relatively uninteresting, the manipulation that's relatively uninteresting because it is the one where we all agree that the more probable the outcome, the more accepting the subject should be, and that for each of 4 birds is what happens. Different orders here, but the more probable the outcome, the more accepting subjects are of it. Now, the more interesting results, though, did not confirm our intuition. They instead confirmed the Krebs-Koselnik model, delay reduction, and the simple optimal diet model. Namely, as you shorten the search time to the poorer outcome, you get less acceptance of it. And that was true for each of these 4 birds. This study, by the way, was also done with human subjects and presented at a SQAB meeting, I believe in Chicago, actually, 4 years ago. Ursula Stockhorst, from Germany, presented her data with human subjects on this procedure, showing that you get, with human subjects, college students and university students in Germany, the same results. Shorten the search time to the poorer outcome, it's more likely to be rejected. So intuition fails, but the models succeed. if I may switch gears just slightly, I'd like to consider the same type of prediction, the corresponding story with the concurrent chains procedure. Let's go back. This is a more recent diagram of the concurrent chains procedure, but it's the same as the very first graph I showed you. Namely, pigeons are choosing in the initial links for two outcomes. Notice here, though, instead of having VI1 or some VIX, it's VIT, and actually I should have T and X because the initial links can be different. The idea of this experiment now is in the concurrent chains procedure, let's vary the initial link leading only to the shorter outcome, leaving the initial link leading to the richer outcome constant. It turns out that delay reduction makes the same prediction here. Shorten the shorten the search time to the poorer outcome, and it should be more likely to be rejected. Okay? So the corresponding prediction that we made that I think was clear in the optimal foraging case is made in the successive encounters procedure, is made also in the concurrent chains procedure. Although models of incentive theory, Peter Killeen, and amelioration theory, Will Vaughan, can be modified, our first application to account for these results, our first application of their models suggested what common sense suggests, namely that should be a monotonic function relating accessibility to accessibility. They should go together. Delay reduction, however, makes this odd prediction here. Over part of the range, there should be just the opposite, this counterintuitive prediction. That accessibility, making the poorer outcome more accessible, should make it more likely to be rejected, should increase preference for the richer outcome. And it turns out two people, again I polled people, 50 people, 60 people. 2 people this time made the correct prediction or predicted the counterintuitive result. One was Peter Killeen, which baffled me. I said, here, look, here's a test of our 2 theories. They make diametrically opposed predictions. And Peter wrote right back and says, oh, of course, doing what you're planning to do, you'll get the results you're predicting. The other person had, and I don't know what was how Peter managed that. But Michael Davison, I know how he managed it. He was the other person who I must say they're better men than I am because I wouldn't have predicted it. Michael said, oh, sure, we collected that data. I said, what? So I said, what do you mean we? And he said, you and I, Fantino and Davison, 1983. I said, we did? He says, yeah. I said, well, I never told you about this, Ed, but and this, of course, was a typical study done at Auckland, 50 data points, 50 different conditions, in other words. And of those 50 conditions, you could pick out 5 conditions that actually tested this assumption. And Michael Davison had, back then in 1983, when we published the study, had actually noticed that if he actually pulled out these 5 points and said, hey, look at this. As you make the poor outcome more accessible, it's rejected more often. And he never told me about it because he thought about it and said, this is ridiculous. I don't know what to make of it. He threw up his hands, and nothing more was said of it. But I asked him the question. He said, oh, yeah, we have data on that. And so Ray Preston went and got his data. And sure enough, they supported the counterintuitive prediction. And so then Ray Preston, for his dissertation, did the study, and every bird showed that decline. Okay. Another counterintuitive prediction, which I will not take time to do justice because you've heard about it recently at SQAB by Hernan Savastano, among others. But I'll just give you a very brief outline. This is a prediction that can be derived from delay reduction, has been derived from delay reduction, which says that the critical relation in the outcome phase is the difference between the outcome stimuli, not the ratio between them. That's also counterintuitive. So that if you have a situation where one outcome stimulus is VI x seconds and the other outcome stimulus is VI x plus 20, and you vary x, in one case you have, let's say, 5 versus 25. In another case you have 105 versus 125. Delay reduction says those two situations are comparable. You should get pretty much the same choice proportion. Our intuition tells us, no, the 525 is going to produce a much bigger choice proportion than the 125, 105. And most theories, and there are exceptions, the contextual choice model for Andy Grace makes, I'll just wreck your pen, Rick, makes comparable predictions to delay reduction. In any case, this is another counterintuitive prediction, and why don't I just go direct? So the predicted data is going to be something like this, for, well, delay reductions in here predicting essentially a flat alternative, whereas the other theories predict this downward slope. Again, there's data in our past which already answered the question. These data were ignored by everyone, including myself, because they just didn't make sense. But Barbara Duncan and I, in a sense, had already shown that the situation was not as our intuitions would require. This study goes back to 1970. We had, and we were interested in something entirely different than this issue, but we had, in the course of our study, looked at FR10 versus FR20, fixed ratio 20 versus fixed ratio 30, and fixed ratio 50 versus fixed ratio 60 choice. The initial links, the choice phase, is constant. So we're varying 10 versus 20, which is a 2-to-1 ratio, on up to 50 versus 60. And everyone's intuition says that choice should be greater for the FR10 over 20 than for the 50 over 60. And the data, in fact, show the opposite. They actually show an increase. You're getting exclusive preference for 50 over 60, whereas preference was more modest than what you'd expect 2-to-1 down here. These, in fact, don't support delay reduction because delay reduction says it should be flat. Intuition says down, delay reduction says flat, data say up. Just as with that study I started with, the 90-30, 30-90, the results were not just supportive, but so supportive that you realize something's wrong. Well, what's wrong here is that fixed ratio schedules, one of the limitations, and I'm fortunately not going to have time in this talk to talk about the limitations of delay reduction theory. But a major limitation of delay reduction theory, and I will refer to this again, is that without free parameters, it has trouble being applied to a variety of situations. In terms of quantitative predictions, it works with variable interval schedules in the outcome phase, but not with other schedules. And I won't go into procedural details. The actual data we collected, this is Hernan and my recent paper, and there's ongoing work exploring the schedule differences here. Here's the constant difference. This is just experiment 2 of our study. Actually, this just has 2 data points. When you keep the ratio constant but vary the difference, then you do get effects on choice. Remember I said difference should matter, not ratio. Back to the constant difference, again, flat. Currently, as I said, we're exploring different schedules of reinforcement to find out the generality of this phenomenon. Clearly, it's not always the case that differences rather than ratios rule choice. We're trying to find out under what conditions that is so. What about the relation to other theories? Those are already discussed in other papers. Peter and I have a paper, I think it's 1990, on at least incentive theory and delay reduction, showing how similar, in fact, they can be. Fantino and Abarca in the BBS article showed the close relationship between optimal diet model of optimal foraging and delay reduction theory. Ray Preston and I also explored some of this. And Enrique Luco Enrique Luco, who's a friend of mine, believe it or not, despite the fact I'm butchering his name. Enrique is a professor, in fact, an award-winning engineer at UCSD, and he had a sabbatical once, and he wrote a paper of comparing various quantitative theories of choice and showed that they're remarkably similar. From his point of view, they're essentially identical, although I think, I don't know, I could go that far, but he showed how closely so many apparently disparate theories are. There are many excellent theories of choice, some of which aim to make accurate predictions over a broad range of choice situations and do so admirably well, as at the cost of some complexity. These quantitatively elegant theories are well known to those of you who have attended SQAB meetings before. While these models begin with different assumptions, they tend to arrive at the same place, as the papers I cited above demonstrate, or similar places. Delay reduction theory, owing to its lack of any free parameters, is limited to accurate quantitative predictions with VI outcome schedules. It has not been the aim of delay reduction theory to be a viable quantitative theory of choice with applicability over a broad spectrum of choice situations. It has instead been our more modest aim to use a simple view, delay reduction, to generate what we believe to be interesting predictions about choice behavior. In some cases, for example, with our human research, which Rick was kind enough to refer to, I discussed here an hour and a half ago at another talk, the research has taken us far afield. In fact, I didn't mention delay reduction at all in my earlier talk, though it provided the original impetus for the research. In addition to foraging, other applications, 4 of which I will not discuss today, are self-control, memory, done by John Wickstead at UCSD, classical conditioning, for example, blocking, and percentage reinforcement studies, done by Marcia Spetch and Roger Dunn, and more recently, Dr. Margaret McDevitt, who just got her degree on the subject last week or 2 weeks ago, and also Terry Belke, whom I've never had the pleasure of meeting, was involved in at least one of the studies. I close by illustrating, in the 4 minutes I have, the application of delay reduction theory to observing behavior, which, in fact, I'll better make it less than 4 minutes. Basically, I will just assume that you know what observing behavior is to save 2 minutes. Namely, subjects make a response, the only effect of which changes the schedule of reinforcement. And many studies have been done on this topic. I think it's an important topic. Under what conditions does information reward behavior? I'll just mention one study. It was done in the laboratory, which has done more than any other on this work, James Dinsmore's laboratory at Bloomington. And one of his students, Augie, in 1974, did a study on observing with a mixed FI1, FI5. The schedule of reinforcement the subject is responding on is either FI1 or FI5. There's no stimulus indicating which it is. The study is important because it's the first one that asks, will the FI5 maintain observing? All the work Dinsmore had done and subsequent work that David Case and I did with human subjects and pigeons show that the bad news doesn't maintain behavior. Only good news does. Relative to no news is good news relative to bad news. Human subjects will choose no news over bad news. What about something that's associated with food but is not, in the context of things, is pretty bad? Will this maintain observing? The answer is no. And this study is really similar to the Gamzu and Schwartz studies on auto-shaping, to Rescorla's classic work on contingency models. How do you explain this in terms of delay reduction, which is not the only way you could explain it? Time to food correlated with the mixed schedule. Well, half the time it's FI1, half the time it's FI5. That's 3 minutes. What happens when the subject observes? Well, if he's producing the FI1, there's a big delay reduction when that stimulus comes on. But if the subject produces the stimulus associated with the FI5, there's an increase in time to reinforcement, not a delay reduction. This stimulus should not be a reinforcer and should not maintain behavior. So, to conclude, whereas Clark Hull, Hull doesn't get talked about these days, especially at ABBA, he had an elaborate quantitative theory that generated many fascinating experiments that ultimately died of complexity. Delay reduction is a very simple theory that ultimately, as a quantitative theory, will die of its simplicity. However, the principle of delay reduction, I believe, is sound. We like our outcomes not just for what they offer, but on how they improve on prior offers. In any case, we've enjoyed doing the experiments generated by delay reduction theory, just as I've enjoyed conveying some of them in its context to you. Thanks.